learned about this formula. Well, it's not really a formula, it's just the probability chapter. If you multiply 90 by 90, you will get exactly, you know the way the frames have a 90% chop through?
Yeah.
So if you have two frames together, they're gonna have like the same size, you just half them. You know, put them in half and have two of them instead. Basically, it's not 90% anymore, it's 81%. So by doing what you told me, I'm putting as one frame instead of two frames. You saved me that 9%, which calculates to like what was it? I think 21.6 points. So not a big difference, like because you know the way the frame has only, let's say the 2x4 has only 24 points, but if you calculate the fact that you need 10 times more damage because 90% of the bullets are not going to hit, it's 240, and then you're adding only 21.6 onto that for even. So you would have to take it off basically if I had two frames, but because I have only one frame, like you told me, and I did that now, it's back to 90. So you're saving me those 21.6%, or not percent, just points overall.
I'm not sure what you're referring to. You're referring to power score or damage?
Damage, the durability points.
Okay, well the durability should be the same between the two of them. The difference between running a single larger part and multiple smaller parts is that multiple smaller parts can be damaged by the same bullet a lot more easily. So in the case of damage pass-through, like you said, you're familiar with the damage continues on afterwards, and thus, you know, the whole spaced armor meta, because there's a cutoff for that. So parts that have damage pass-through to begin with, like frames, will always let damage through up to the 7 pips behind them. So if you have one 8x4 piece, and it gets shot on the, you know, the long, or it gets shot on the short end and the projectile passes through the long way, it's only going to damage that one frame, assuming, you know, it doesn't go at an angle underneath and hit parts above it or whatever. So not only is a single 8x4 going to be a lot tougher than, you know, 4 2x4s, but you're only hitting that health pool once. So for instance, with, like I do have the stream open again, I don't know if you're watching it, but I can just verbally do the mock-up. If you have the 8x4 poking out at the end, so let's say we use a lightweight one in our example because you are running lightweight frames primarily on this kind of light build. So it has 56
Can I ask you a
durability.
question before you continue? Because there's one thing I don't understand.
Yeah.
I didn't know that if the damage passes through, it's gonna hit both of the frames. I thought if it passes, if you hit that 10% chance where it does hit the frame, or differently, if it does pass through, if you hit that 90% chance where it does pass through. Wait, what do you mean exactly by it hits two? I thought it only hits one.
So this might have been a misunderstanding when you were learning the damage pass-through system. So, because you said you're Polish, right? That's your first language. So it's possible it's just a translation thing. So the way the damage pass-through works is it's not a chance of hitting. All damage is always dealt in the game. What a 90% damage pass-through means is that instead of taking the full damage, it lets 90% damage go through and it only takes 10% damage. So as a result, it will let things behind it get damaged, which is the reason why the spaced armor meta exists, because the damage will only pass through for another 7 pips or connector points or whatever you want to call them, the little blocks when you turn on the AR mode. So when you have me trying to use my controller one hand and not working out well. So when you have a single part that says, hey, let's just do an example of saying that we have a single part with 100 durability. I don't actually know if there are any parts that have exactly 100 durability. That seems a little bit too convenient, but okay,
I think I understand now. I don't know if you need to explain it. So basically, it hits the first part, it only deals 10% of damage. 90 passes through to the next one. Let's say the next one's a frame again. It's going to deal also 10% damage again, and then pass to 90% again.
Yeah, exactly. So the disadvantage of that being that if you have multiple parts stacked up, while they only each take 10% damage, each is also taking 10% damage. So in the case of the lightweight frame of an 8x4, if it gets hit, it's going to take 10% damage. So let's say we hit it for 100 damage, for instance. In this case, it would only take 10% of that, so it would take the 10 damage, and then the damage would pass through until it dissipates. So if somebody shot it at the very edge on the short face along the long side, then it's the only part that gets hit, and you take basically 10 damage total. Of course, the way the game works is it doesn't show damage before things get blown off, so you'd take the 10 points of durability off of it, but you wouldn't directly see that. But it is something you should know. If we have multiple 2x4s stacked up, these have 14 health each. If somebody shoots it, sorry, are you watching the stream?
Yeah, I am, and I just
Excellent.
figured out that whatever I did with the calculations still makes sense in this case, because when you have two parts in the example I gave you previously, instead of 90% of the damage going into pass through, it's going to be only 81% of damage going through pass through.
Right, for the second part, but what I'm getting at here is that each part still takes 10% damage.
So you just keep multiplying by 0.9, and you can just kind of calculate how much damage you're going to have.
Right, but it does end up generally being higher because of the multiple parts being hit. So for instance, if I have the 4 2x4 frames stacked up like this, while each of them only takes 10% of the damage, each of them takes 10% of the damage. So for instance, the first part would take, if it's a 100 damage shot, it would still take 10 damage, and then it would pass through 90% of the damage. Then the next part would get hit with the 90 damage, and it would take its 90% of that. So you'd be taking another 9-ish damage, and then that continues on to the next part. So the next part also takes about 8-ish damage, and the next part also takes 7-ish damage. So it hits you 4 times, 4 different parts, and as a result you end up taking closer to 35 damage than just 10 damage. So this is also the same, I don't want to say problem, but this is the same thing that happens with attacks that hit multiple parts at once, such as with melee or with a explosion radius. So while you mentioned using multiple smaller parts rather than a single large part, I'm not sure what and I'm not going to say that that's inherently wrong, because for instance that's kind of the point of a couple of different armoring strategies, but generally speaking, me as a player, I try and get hit when only one part for less damage than multiple, because when you end up hitting 100 damage across 3 parts, you end up taking a lot more damage than if you had just had the one part. So if let's do another.
So to me it makes sense to do it in side by side instead of in a row, if you know what I mean.
In a sense, but because people can attack you from any direction, having them stacked up doesn't necessarily help in that regard. Likewise, if you use a bunch of 1x8 frames, for instance, so if I stack all of these like this, and you probably won't want to run anything as insane as that, but you could. Just slap a couple parts on.
But I don't think any gun will reach that far. You would need a very shallow angle to actually pass that far.
Depends what you mean by pass that far, because to hit multiple ones, all you'd have to be is, well, like you said, like an extremely shallow angle would allow them to hit multiple. So I'm not sure the damage values of weapons. Unfortunately, it's not very clear, so I'm just gonna have to sort of figure this out at the same time you do with the way it works. Except we don't want projectiles, so what's a good... Let me use a sinus. Except that also increases damage on hit. Great, we'll use the piercer. So, damage of a piercer, I'm just gonna get really close so I don't get any damage drop off. So it looks like it's about 7 damage per shot, 6.5-ish at rounds, obviously. So let's say 6 damage a shot. If we shoot the cabin directly, it takes full damage, which makes sense. If we shoot the single part, then we're only dealing the 1/10 of that damage. And likewise, if we only hit a single part on the front, then we're also only dealing the 1/6 of the damage. However, if you have multiple frames like this, if I hit it from the side instead, then the damage is going to pass through and hit all of those frames. So you can see I'm dealing the 1/2 damage, or whatever the math ends up being, to each frame. So while, like you said, if they just hit it lengthwise so the damage passes through and dissipates before hitting other part, it's still only 1/6. So the one, maybe there's a better damage example. If I'm even at a slightly shallow angle, then I can actually end up hitting multiple of their frames at once again. Yeah, so this isn't showing very well with the low damage value of this. So let's do... See, it'd almost be easiest if I had a scorpion, but I don't. So let's see if the adapter maybe deals enough damage to make this.
And I'm guessing there's going to be a lot bigger of a problem with like explosive weapons, because I'm guessing the radius goes up as a sphere just in every single direction. Mm-hmm. So you're definitely going to hit every single one of those.
Yeah. So okay, so this deals 41. It's not quite straightforward because it's 41 damage, but it shoots 5 projectiles. But it should work well enough for seeing the damage distance, because it was kind of hard with the piercer because of how low of damage it dealt. So 1/10 of this is still 41 damage. So for instance, that's 41 damage, and then if I shoot this, it should only be 4 damage, which makes sense because it's only taking 10% of the damage, and then because of how long the piece is, it dissipates. Likewise, if I attack the one on the front, it's still only 4 damage because it's taking 10% of the damage. But if I shoot it at, like, perpendicular, then I end up dealing 41 damage because I'm hitting every single one of those frames with it. So even though that one was the first to pop off, can very quickly see that it's damaging all of them. So I'm not able to use them like multiple layers of armor. So likewise, if I'm at even a very, very shallow angle, so let's say I am sniping, for instance, because normally, most of the time, you're not going to be facing directly opposite direction of the other person, right? That's normally like if you're in CQC and they're trying to ram you and you're backing up or something, right? Normally what happens, I've found, is that you're at a slight angle when you're shooting at other people. So as a result here, even with a very, very slight angle, I can hit multiple frames and deal more than the 4 damage I deal if I were only hitting one. So this is a relatively shallow angle, like this is probably only like a 15-degree offset, and yet still I can basically double the damage I'm dealing to their frames because I'm hitting multiple because of the damage pass through. On the flip side, if it were something like non-damage pass through parts, so let's take these bus parts as an example because they're really big. So these things have 51 health each, which is not a lot in the grand scheme of things, but it's kind of even more ridiculous because it's 51 damage on a rather large part. So if they act anything like the frames, then I'd be able to shoot off all of them in 2 volleys, for instance. But because these don't actually let damage through, it'll be 41 damage. So it has, what is it, 52 health? I think I said, I wasn't paying attention. So it has 51 or 52 health, I don't remember. But it has 9 or 10 health left. But it actually eats most of the damage if you're using a single projectile weapon, because you're only going to be hitting the one part. When you have multiple projectiles, like in this case, it actually transfers 2 to the one behind it, but still I'm only shooting off 1 with every second shot, or I guess 1 with every shot due to the damage following through. So if we have something that has, say, 82 durability, This will maybe show better. This is what I said, where it's kind of difficult due to the multi-shot nature of this weapon. It would almost be better if I had a single shot weapon, but I don't. Which is why it also gets really complex really quickly, and why it can definitely be hard to learn some of these mechanics, because they don't always act intuitively. So for instance, each of these parts will die in about 2 shots. But it ends up being a bit tankier than the frames for the amount of durability they have. So I don't know if that helps clarify at all, but like you did mention, you can extrapolate that to also apply to things with explosive damage and see that it does kind of get pretty ridiculous pretty fast. So for instance, the Therm is an autocannon, so it's pretty better yet. Why don't I just use a Cyclone? Because that thing deals a lot of damage per shot. So an issue with the Cyclone, it looks like it's about 21 damage for the main projectile. And that's not very much damage at all, right? But the thing is, as an autocannon, it actually has an explosive projectile. So when I shoot something directly, it's only 21 damage. But because of the explosion radius, if I hit multiple parts on the side, they'll each take that damage. So you can end up dealing 2 to 3 times the damage at once. And then of course it's way worse with using larger and larger projectiles. So for instance, I think the Avalanche is probably the biggest explosion in damage in the game. So of course this isn't going to have enough energy. Actually, let's do a cabin without a perk, that'll fix it.
How much energy does the Avalanche take?
12. It and the Kaiju are considered single weapon, or single weapon build weapons, if that makes sense. So they...
Yeah, I get it.
They are, they're pretty crazy. Unfortunately, because they take 12 energy, they also can't be used on heavies without generators, which means if somebody pops your generator, then you are as well. So the Avalanche deals a lot of damage, 700 damage per shot, which is effectively to say that even if you threw on like the toughest pieces you've got, they're probably going to get killed pretty quickly. Okay, so here's a great example. The regular frames with their 90% damage ignore can actually tank 2 shots. And I'm going to use some tankier wheels here just so that they don't get blown off, which would kind of defeat the purpose of what I'm trying to show. But I think they'll still probably suffer some damage just as a result of the enormous blast radius of the thing. So here we have 2 equivalences of health. So this is going to be the same amount of power score, the same amount of mass, the same amount of durability. But it's going to be comparing one part to the 4 smaller parts. So the one part can tank a shot because it has effective health of 960 due to the 10% damage resistance. Or sorry, 90% damage pass through. So if I shoot it, that frame stays connected. But each of these smaller ones only have 14 health, and this thing dealing 700 damage, even divided by the, the 10, is still more than enough damage to kill them. Oh, this is terribly floppy. This thing is just too heavy for what I'm trying to do with it. Yeah, so any direct hit on the frame knocks it off. It's interesting because it looks like the blast radius isn't affecting the other ones, which is what I would have expected, just knocking off a bunch of the parts. Oh, there we go. At the second shot, I hit them all. but it is also in this instance the same without the damage pass through, because the projectile of the avalanche, it just deals so much damage, it basically one-shots like most parts. So even if I replace the frames without something with damage pass through, so say these APC side parts which have almost 70 health each, it still blows them off because the explosion radius on this is so large. So if I were to, how much health is this? Yeah, about 70 each, so about half of the build's health is just on those parts. So if you get hit by the single shot and it blows off all 4 of those, which it will because it deals so much damage, then you've lost about half your health on this build immediately. If you use a bunch of smaller parts, just gonna try and make it tip guard real fast. Of course I go over mass really quickly because I'm using a light cabin with the avalanche of all things.
So how much durability do the level 30 parts have in Steppenwolf?
They should be the same within the faction. That actually leads to the structural part calculator, which I can also get to. I'm going to put some non-structural parts on the back to prevent the tipping, just so that the pool isn't diluted by them. So for instance here I have 22 health times 8. I guess I can just fill it all the way. So there's 220 health, 220 durability worth of parts with all those downstreams. But because none of them have the durability to tank the shot, if I can damage all of them in one shot, I'm blowing off 220 damage worth. In this case it actually blew up the cabin behind it too. Yeah, so it just deals a massive amount of damage if you have a bunch of small parts. And that being said, in this instance, because the avalanche just deals so much damage that it will basically hit anything and destroy it, there's not really a whole lot of stuff you can do against it to prevent the parts from, you know, being all hit with it. But it's primarily more useful to know against like small arms fire, things like machine guns or shotguns, say, because it prevents them from, you know, stripping a bunch of different parts at once. And in the case of explosions, if the explosion is weak enough that it's not going to one-hit the part, then you can end up potentially taking more damage. So if I go back to, say, the Cyclone, and I shoot these, it's 21 damage and they each have 22 health, so they should be tanking one shot each. Yeah, but I can still just two-shot all of them. So when I shoot at somebody who's using a bunch of downstreams like that, I can deal more than the 21 damage of the shot because it'll deal to it the damage to each part in the radius, which is, like you were saying earlier, that's the point of spaced armor. So it's not to say that you can't use many parts stacked up, just that against explosions especially, there's that risk of damage. And then if you have a damage pass-through part, it's the exact same thing, but rather than having a radial damage problem, you have a linear damage problem because the part will let damage through and hit the stuff behind it, right? So it was kind of the point of what I was getting at with the lightweight, or with the frame specifically, because the damage will continue through it. If you use a bunch of the smaller parts and they hit you perpendicular, then you risk losing all these parts at once due to the same amount of damage. Of course, like I said, there's the 10% taken off by each, so of course the last one will only take like 65% of the damage of the main shot, so it'll last the longest, but they'll all be getting damaged each time, whereas with the 8x4 it's an all or nothing sort of thing. So I don't know if that maybe clarifies stuff for you at all.
No, well, it doesn't really clarify. I understood it from the start, but it gives me like more knowledge about this, so it's helpful anyway.
Yeah, and that's the exact same reason why people use the spaced armor. So like I said, because against some of the high tier explosive weaponry, so primarily the cannons, but there are some other ones like rocket launchers a little bit, auto cannons of course. So against these things, when you're dealing the amount of damage to destroy nearly any part in one shot, it doesn't really matter how much armor you have stacked up in one area, or if you use a bunch of small pieces or fewer large ones, they're basically all going to get blown off anyway. So what people like doing is using the spaced armor idea. So it's doing, by definition, the opposite. So rather than having a bunch of parts grouped up and taking damage at the same time, they're spacing them out, so that stuff doesn't take damage. So let's say, for instance, I have... Well, we can even just use my cabin, because that's easy enough. So if the cabin dies, I die. But because the projectile properties stop after 7 pips of being hit, me trying to make a symmetrical build in the game, hating that idea. Okay. Each of these parts have their 10% damage taken, of course, because they're the 90% damage passed through again. And because there's nothing behind them within 7 pips, this is actually the functionality of spaced armor, which is that it basically eats most of the damage with very few like actual damage taken by the build. So for instance, this shot deals 21 damage. If I hit multiple together, of course it deals more, as we've seen, but the projectile just by itself deals 21 damage each. And these elbows have, I believe, 34 health each, with 90% damage pass through. So if I hit it, I guess it's not. Let's see, 29. Okay, I'll just use larger parts because it looks like I was hitting multiple there still. So these are 38 durability with 90% damage pass through. There we go. So you see, I'm only dealing the 21, you know, the 10%, so the 2 damage to the part with each shot. So because this thing has 38 durability, it can actually eat a bunch of the shots. And if you don't have anything behind it within the 7 pips, nothing behind it takes the damage. So that's why spaced armor is nice, because you can have one part with damage pass through take 10 times as much damage as, say, another part, as long as you have that buffer room of space behind it so that the damage gets deleted rather than passed on to parts. So same restrictions as before. Of course, if I shoot at an angle and can hit parts directly behind, I can deal more damage. Or not in this instance.
While
what's
we're
up
talking
with
about damage, I could also ask you a question, a quick one.
Sure.
What's the difference between the yellow numbers and the white numbers?
that's just cabin damage versus part damage. So for instance, if you shoot a cabin, yellow. If you shoot a part, white. So there's actually a weapon that does a little bit of both. The Helios. So this thing's perk is pretty cool. It's that if you hit with all your shots, the cabin takes damage directly. So if I hit parts, like we saw, damage gets basically deleted by the spaced armor. So if I shoot at it, it's only taking the white damage, but the perk is actually still dealing cabin damage. So you can even see at this angle, I'm definitely not hitting the cabin directly, but the perk lets me hit that. So it's actually very annoying to fight the bots in hard raids with the Helios, because it gets rid of a lot of the armoring strategies. So as you saw there, the Helios can be extremely effective even against spaced armor, because even if I hit your spaced armor and you normally delete all the damage, I still deal damage directly to your cabin. Likewise, if you use movement parts as protection, it's the exact same thing. So I'm still dealing cabin damage directly. So if you're on a rather fragile build that's using movement parts for protection, you can't actually rely on them to save you. So for instance, I'm going to slap the biggest, meatiest movement part we have on, the Goliath track. So this thing has 1600 durability, and it also has 25% damage resistance against bullets and projectiles. So suffice to say, it's pretty tanky under most circumstances. However, if I don't put any armor on the build and just rely on that to protect me, then if I use the Helios, so what's the cabin durability? Yeah, so the cabin durability itself is only 300, so in this case you can actually kill the cabin of the build before you actually even shoot through the part of the Goliath. So for instance, if I shoot at this, I deal 122 to it, and then 46 to the damage, or 46 to the cabin with each hit. So you can see I'm actually setting the cabin on fire from indirect damage due to the perk before I even destroy the Goliath track. So that's why Helios can be super annoying in raids, is because you generally rely on different build strategies like spaced armor using movement parts, and then Dawn's Children bots just roll up and are like, hey, that's really cool armor you have there, it sure would be a shame if somebody like just damaged your health points directly. It's the same thing with bumpers too. So as you mentioned, the suggestion online is to use bumpers a lot for protecting parts. So the reason behind that, primarily as I understand it, is because these parts tend to be very, what I would call, armor dense. So they have a lot of durability and not a lot of size. So for instance, if we look at something like the bumper catch, this part has 53 durability, and that's actually what I believe you were using as armor on your build, right? For your autocannons?
Yeah, that one. But I was more thinking about it, not really that much dense armor, but just it has high durability in terms of, or in relation to power score and mass. That's the main reason I'm using them.
Yeah, so an example is, for instance, compared to the Sendan, which is literally the same durability, or even the Hot Rod or the Avia part or whatever. All of these parts are significantly larger, which means that they're harder to armor weapons with. So for instance, you could slap the Hot Rod hood directly in front of the weapon instead of the bumper catch, but in the amount of space it takes for the Hot Rod hood, you can fit multiple of these smaller bumpers, so you can end up with higher, like I was saying, armor density, so the same amount of health in less space, which is sort of the same thing as just running, you know, like the fewer larger parts. If you run really dense layers right behind each other, it makes it harder for them to chew through because there's less total health, right? So for instance, if I have the Hot Rod hood, 53 durability, and then maybe they're damaging my weapon directly, whereas you can fit multiple of these bumper catches in less than the same amount of space. and then have triple the durability, right? So as far as the ratios, that is another factor. The disadvantage being, like I said, it doesn't actually contribute directly to your vehicle health. So if you just have a build of bumpers, then you're not actually increasing your cabin durability at all. So while, for instance, this might be making you really tanky from the front if somebody shoots at you, preferably without the weapon that ignores armor.
I'd say using bumpers is a good layer if it's the most inside layer, because usually once they get through my outside layer onto my inside layer, my guns are gone anyway, so they might as well just kill me at that point.
Yeah. So that's exactly it, right? Like you can soak a bunch of damage from the bumpers on the front, but then of course, if they shoot you from behind or a different angle, it's going to be a lot easier to kill you because there isn't anything protecting it, or if you're using a bunch of small armor pieces because you use most of your mass on it, it doesn't work. So what I was getting at with this is basically running bumpers as durability. Like you said, it's an extremely popular idea, especially for protecting weapons, because of the ludicrously high amount of durability they have. So, for instance, in the case of the train plows, which are probably the most popular one for doing this.
Is it a 1-to-1 ratio? So if you get like a part that has 100 durability, it's going to add 100 durability to the cabin?
Yeah, so for instance, right now it's at 300 durability, and I can add a part with 21. And it's now at 321. It's sort of a continuation of the conversation of the difference between vehicle durability and cabin durability. So like I said, the bumpers don't directly contribute. So even though the train plows have massive pools of health, and they can tank 416 damage each, which is just, like, it's absurd. Like, it's gonna take you a while. For instance, like, I don't have any, like, weapon perks, or, like, radiators or a co-driver or anything, but it basically takes the entire overheat cycle for me to chew through them with 2 equalizers, which are, like, notoriously some of the highest damage-dealing weapons in the game. Whereas if I...
Yeah, those train plows are terrible as in to fight against, because when I used the borers, it was just impossible to troll through them sometimes.
Exactly, and that's the other benefit of them, is as a result of them being bumpers, they have the 90% damage resistance to melee. So that's another reason why they're really popular on, you might have seen some designs like wedges is what they're called, so they're basically enormous, like, angled blocks where they might try and, like, get you stuck on top of them. They did do some updates within the last year that made them not as prevalent, which is great because it literally used to be like wedge or bust for builds. But that's sort of the other advantage of using bumpers, is not only the enormous health pool with, like I said, the disadvantages listed, especially with how heavy they are, but also the fact that they can soak even more damage to melee. So for instance, if I use, let's say, harvesters, so the most damaging melee part, and let's say I even go crazy and I go all out and I use 2 harvesters. Then these things will absolutely mulch through structural parts. So let's go say hi to the car. So this is sort of the same thing I was getting at with the explosive radius, where you can hit multiple parts at once and thus deal more damage than what the actual, like, value of the item is. So in the case of the harvesters, while you can of course grind on one part and deal the, you know, X damage per second, you can also hit multiple parts and deal that damage to each part itself. So it'll absolutely destroy a bunch of structural parts in quick succession, if it's hitting them all. Of course, doesn't work when you run out of parts to destroy. because it's damaging each of those parts with the full damage value of it. But, like you mentioned, the train plows are incredibly resilient, not only to begin with, but especially against melee. So if I go and try and chew on pretty much any other structural part, this deals enough damage that it basically destroys it almost immediately thereafter, right? But if I try and chew on train plows, it's not actually dealing that much damage at a time. So it's dealing it between the two of them, it's dealing 9 damage per tick between the other 2 train plows. So not only do they have enormous amounts of durability, but they also have that enormous amount of durability multiplied against melee. So that's why you generally see these most frequently used, as the name would imply, as bumpers on the exterior. And they're also really effective for preventing things like wedging or the borer builds at the 2500 power score. Because that took way too long for me to chew through. Like, if somebody was shooting at me, I'd probably have been dead by then. Whereas if I go and just attack the cabin directly, of course it's way easier to kill.
A higher PS levels like the ones you're playing on, do people often get, what's the word, like blocked by the amount of tonnage they have on the car?
It sort of depends on how you build it, because there's both the tonnage and the mass. So my build theory is generally, and how I kind of approached it, not with your build but with others in the past, is I'll generally approach it by saying I want to run X weapon, then I'll pick a cabin that suits that. I'll pick some supporting hardware of, say, X amount, say 3-4 energy, know that I need X amount of, you know, extra energy from generators, and then I can see what I need as far as speed of the vehicle and mass. So for instance, of course, the lighter cabins are going to have significantly less tonnage than heavier ones. So if I say, okay, well, I want to make a, you know, say I want to go with the double harvester build, then I could look at which cabins I want to run alongside it. Oh, or my connection could fail. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Guessing
Good,
it's
but
just the
I want-
Xbox.
You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm asking about the tonnage, because you gave me a good idea. Well, I'm not probably going to use it, but you gave me an idea anyway. So, if you're ever limited by tonnage, and you don't want to add more parts, you could just do some weak kind of connection, and build a bunch of durable parts that aren't bumpers, which you can just shoot off or break off somehow with an explosion at the start of the game, because those points will still be added to your cabin durability.
Yes and no. So the way, maybe I didn't explain it very well, the way that the durability works for structural parts or the cabin is, let's say I use the Omnibox. So this specific cabin has 369 durability. I wonder if there's maybe a nicer value we can use, just to make the math a little bit easier. There we go. Okay, so the call has 300 health. So it stands to reason if I hit it with, actually, is there a 421? Close enough. Great. Oops, these are wheels, not weapons. I was wondering where the adapters went. Okay, so let's take a look at the Nova cabin as an example. So it has 420 durability. We know that the burst of an adapter deals about 42 damage with each shot, right? So in theory, it means that I should be able to sustain 9 bursts, and then on the 10th I die, right? So there's 1, 2, 3, so that's 9 volleys, 3 volleys from each. And then if I mean, it's on fire. If I hit it again with the cabin with another burst, then it blows up, right? And that makes sense. That's how we expect. If you slap on armor, personally, I'm a fan of heavy armor, as you can probably tell with me running all the APC parts in all the examples. So let's say I slap on a disgusting amount of APC armor parts. So I now have 1247 durability, significantly more. Now if I shoot the cabin directly, of course it still loses the damage directly. And even though it has 1247 durability, I can just deal that all directly to the cabin and it'll blow up. So maybe a better example would be if I turn on the group damage numbers.
Wait, so how much do you have to deal damage to the cabin?
Pardon?
How much damage did you have to deal to the cabin?
1247, the number at the bottom. So that's what I actually just turned on the group numbers so you can see that, and it's a little bit easier when you're doing small damage values. But when I'm dealing the large ones, of course, yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's exactly what I imagined. I still don't see at what point you're saying that it won't work, my tactic.
So that's what I'm getting at. So if you deal the damage directly to cabin, it depletes the bar directly and it blows off. That makes sense. What happens when you destroy armor is actually a little bit different. So I don't recall the exact calculation myself, so we're gonna have to do some testing here. But if I add, let's see if there's a 140 durability. Well, I guess that's kind of the closest there is, isn't there? Okay. So if I throw on 3 of the APC roof parts, I basically double my cabin durability. So I go from 419 to 840. These parts together are about 420 durability. And if I blow just them off without taking any damage directly to the cabin, then I actually lose that damage. So I'm now back down to just my cabin durability. So you could do the same thing with, for instance, a module called the Rift, which is very popular for fusion builds, where you can run a bunch of extra armor,
So if it works that way, it doesn't really make a huge difference. Like, the bumpers aren't really a big deal, because like I thought the damage still stays on the cabin, as in the cabin's health is still going to be 1200 or whatever it is if you shoot off the armor. But if that doesn't change, or if it does actually change and the cabin health goes down as you lose the armor,
yeah,
then it doesn't really matter. It's not a big deal with the bumpers, because let's say if those armor parts were actually bumpers, if you're assuming they're going to be shot off anyway before your cabin explodes,
right,
there's no difference.
Kind of.
That's only assuming if you're if people are gonna shoot directly at the cabin without shooting off all the armor parts, then it does make a difference.
Yeah, and so likewise, like you said here, and like I was pointing out, of course, if I use the Rift and I blow off the part, I take that damage. So as a result, it's actually, I can't really show it in here in the test range very easily. But for instance, there's a couple of cabin perks that work based off of the amount of damage you receive. But they did make it so that you can't just, for instance, rift parts. So if I go and I take the damage directly, or even indirectly by just on like a track or whatever, I can charge up the Humpbacks perk, which is whenever I take damage, I deal more damage. But damage from the rifts don't actually count, because it's not actually damage. They did code that differently. Which is sort of an interesting nuance, but it makes sense, because then people could do exactly what you're saying. They could have 1,000 durability attached here, and then when the lobby starts, they just pop that off, and now boom, they have their 30% damage bonus. So they don't let us do that, which makes sense. The thing about bumpers is, yeah, there's, like you said, there's definitely a lot of potential advantages to it, and there's also potential disadvantages. So it's a matter of balancing those. So for instance, I don't think there's any build I have where I don't use bumpers. Like here I have the APC parts and flails. Here I have partial damage pass-through on the cabin. Here I have durable parts, even on the big builds. Like I'll use trim plazas and whatnot to soak damage on the front. So it's not to say that you can't or shouldn't use them, but if you do rely on them 100% for your, your durability, then there are risks as a result of that, because it doesn't increase your cabin durability. So another example is fire. I don't suppose you've probably seen a whole lot of like fire weapons at the artillery at your power score, I should hope.
Just bots and medium raids. I rarely sometimes do use them.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal point. Yeah. So for instance, if I just absolutely layer on the bumpers on this, which, like you said, it is an option. It's not to say that you can't, or under no degrees that you should. Like, there are certain situations where you'll want it more than others. But if I
that's the beauty of Crossout. You can really use anything in that certain cases. Everything works if you have a good tactic for it.
Exactly. It's about where and how you use the stuff, rather than ideas necessarily being explicitly good or bad. So in this instance, I have 419 health, and all of my cabin is pretty well protected here. So there's... can't really move that up as is. So I guess I could just do... So there's an example. So now my cabin's completely protected. You wouldn't be able to deal direct damage to it unless you got like this very niche angle, or you shot off the parts or whatnot. But all of my health is like, still directly damageable by the cabin. So if you go and use something that deals AoE damage, that's not the weapons again. Like, for instance, the incinerators. No, I don't want to download you. Then even though I have a bunch of bumpers protecting me, theoretically, I can still deal damage directly to the cabin. And it's exacerbated with things like the porcupines, which are incredibly annoying to fight against. So if I have a bunch of barrels with fire launched underneath me, they can actually blow up the cabin nearly directly. It's actually kind of funny because the porcupines dealt enough damage to actually blow the parts off to begin with, but that's kind of what you get with relic weapons. So yeah, certainly, like I said, there's nothing wrong with using bumpers, but it's about being effective with them primarily. So your example of using them on like protecting your weapons is a great use point of them, and that's where you generally see them a lot, again because of how dense they are. Personally, because they don't contribute to the cabin HP, and actually they're not the best in slot option, I generally refrain from using them, but it's going to be dependent on what you have available for you at the ranks you have available, right? So for instance, as a newbie, you're going to have other parts available like the fender, and these are very popular for wrapping weapons as well. But the thing is, that while this
I think I tried to use that part, except on my I think I'm using the storms. Yeah, it doesn't fit so nicely. It doesn't want to slot in like it does here.
Yeah,
I think was this part.
Yeah, weapon hitboxes are everywhere, so there's a lot of you gotta play around basically with each different weapon and find what works for it. So for instance, it works with the rapier. It not working with the storm wouldn't be a surprise, and there'll be other weapons where it does work with, but it'll block off rotation. In any case, fenders are very popular because of course most weapons are circular or cylindrical to a certain extent. Most of them have clearance over the bottom pip where they're connected, and thus they can shoot over armor parts in their way. And of course they're also, I mean, you get a bunch of them as a newbie, so they're pretty popular for that. The problem, if you want to call it that, is that they're at relatively low durability. So for the stage that you're at, having 2 enormous parts with 26 durability is probably not as appealing to you as running something that's literally half the size and twice the durability of them each. So the bumper catch is really nice for that. It does still have the disadvantages, of course, of the, you know, the melee bumpers, and for instance it's a little bit harder to wrap around since of course they're just straight parts, but this does give you more durability in significantly less space, and that's kind of the concept of like armor density, armor durability. So for instance, one of the most popular parts for wrapping, which you should actually have available to you in the badge exchange right now because it came from a battle pass, is the reflector. So this is just slightly larger than the bumper catch. Rather than being a 1x1x6, it's a 1x1x6 with 2 1x1x1s on the side, so its total volume is 8. Yet it still has more durability. So if you compare the 2 parts, not only does it look a lot better, but it actually has more durability, gives you cabin health directly, and just overall does a better job of protecting it. Now, like you said though, there are trade-offs where it does have higher power score, and it does have significantly higher mass, but this is like one of the most popular parts for armoring weapons, just as a result of being so compact and high durability. So those might be something you might want to look into. I don't know if they'll work around the storm due to its hitbox, but that is an example of another part that you could use. Or of course there's a variety of other fenders you could use. There's other bumpers too. It's not uncommon that you'll see people use the train plows, kind of actually how I had them set up.
How accurate are the hitboxes in that game? Like, do you think the hitbox is going to be exactly the shape of that part you just showed me? Or is hitbox just going to be an actual just 1x1x6 square? Or rectangle? Cuboid?
You talking about the reflector?
I think it was reflector. Just the white part you showed me.
Yeah, so the hitboxes in the game tend to be pretty good. The example being that it does like cut off rotation pretty much as expected as a result of this back module getting cut off whenever you try and rotate it. The hitting of it itself is pretty accurate. So for instance, if I use a scope with a lot of zoom, then it performs pretty similar to as expected, which is to say, probably be easier if I put the scope in a place where you can actually see it directly. Not to say this is a good place to set up your scope anyway, but so normally where you'd expect it to miss, and your scope is actually in line with your weapon, it does. Right, so you can see I can get pretty close to it before just the spread of the weapon causes it to hit it. So the hitboxes are pretty accurate overall. Now projectiles, which is what this weapon runs, actually have a worse time with hit detection than hit scan weapons, because projectiles will have a hitbox basically. So if I use a hit scan weapon like the Miller, well, it's barely going to be able to turn, but whatever. This makes it easy to hit straight forward. Then you can actually cut a lot closer with them, because the way that it works is it's basically a line trace. Because hit scan means that there isn't transit time for the weapon projectile, it just immediately hits. So other than when it spreads enough to actually like hit the cabin, you can actually get really close to it. So that's actually another disadvantage of projectile weapons, and that's why the spaced armor is very popular is because projectiles have this basically area where they can hit rather than just being a distinct line. You can basically space stuff kind of ridiculously and still hit without people being able to hit back. So I guess it'll probably be exhibition examples. So I guess actually that first one's not a bad example. So you can have very narrow boxes for actually shooting a projectile, because all you need to do is have the barrel be clear so it can shoot, right? But be extremely hard to actually hit them back, just due to how projectiles work. So another pretty easy example would be if I slap on the cyclones again, and then I give them sort of pillboxes. And then obviously, as long as I have my cursor on my target, I can hit them. But as a result of the projectile properties, it can be very hard for me to hit those weapons. So even if I'm looking directly at them, it's much more frequently hitting those parts in front of it. So in this case, I might have actually not dealt any damage directly to the weapons at all. And that I mean, it's not the only reason, but that's one of the reasons why hit scan weapons are pretty popular, is because you can do that to a significantly worse degree when your weapon doesn't have to worry about projectile properties. So for instance, if I slap a hit scan weapon in instead, I'll just use one so it's a little bit easy to see. Then again, barring spread, I can actually directly hit that part because the projectile isn't getting like hit detection on the others. And there's a bunch of examples of like wonky hit detection in the game. The physical mesh doesn't always match the in-game mesh, and it's something that they've been working on and off for like updating, of course, but it's not been like a main priority that like, oh, everything must be perfectly exemplary of how you'd expect it to work. So for instance, the augers are personally a pain point for me because the hitbox of this is about 4x4 for the auger itself, and it's about, 5 tall total with the attachment points. So logically, because of the way the box is, you would expect to be able to put another one in series. Or maybe you don't, but I at least do. So for instance here, you can see that like the hitbox of the auger doesn't extend past this pip, right? So logically you'd expect to be able to put another one directly thereafter, but you can't. So even though there's no actual overlap, the physical mesh is set up in a way that you can't directly mount them beside each other.
Yeah, I noticed that with the guns, some of them, you have that box around them or the circle around them, and even if you build in such a way that they're not touching each other, it still won't let you build that close.
Yeah, exactly. There's other wonkiness. So for instance, the flash and the spark. I guess I should probably actually have a cabin still. So the flash and the spark are like pretty obviously a 4x4 base, but you can see that their hitbox extends a little bit. And despite the weapon's base being symmetrical, so it's the same in all directions, right? It doesn't matter where you look, that base doesn't rotate, it's just the weapon itself. Despite that, you can't actually put reflectors around it on the side, but you can put it around on the front and back perfectly. And it doesn't even cut off any of the rotation or anything. So as a result, you can put the spark or the flash on sideways on the build, and it will still function and shoot in the way that you want it to. So for instance, I even have it on my builds where I have the weapon starts quote unquote facing sideways, just so I can have the reflectors facing the direction I want. Another example is the Caucasus aren't symmetrical either, so while you can't put them directly in between reflectors, you can put them sideways in between reflectors, just like the spark and flash. So yeah, there's a bunch of wonkiness. In fact, some cabins aren't even symmetrical, which is super annoying when you're trying to armor them. So I think I actually have it on the exhibition. May have gotten rid of it because they reworked the step spider program. Actually, that's exactly what I did. But for instance, if I place down some armor here, then you can actually do something like fit a buggy engine cover alongside here, which makes sense. It physically fits. And that's not an issue with it. But the front of this cabin isn't actually symmetrical for mesh reasons. Because if I slap that, I can put that there. But I can put it all the way back on that side. So you see how I can have it touching the grill, but over here you can't actually. It considers that hex partially occupied for whatever reason. Even though, like, physically, the cabin mesh is identical on both sides of that point.
Yeah.
So there's some wonkiness, and like sometimes they get updated and sometimes they don't. It's really a crapshoot. Part of it is probably people like me not really actually reporting it, to be fair. But like the auger one, they're aware of, because that actually used to be a thing. You used to be able to double stack it, and they took that functionality away. Interestingly, you can actually stack them the opposite way though. So it actually needs to be further. So you can have them touching this way, for instance, for the augers, but you can't have them in series. Or how the trucker cabin lets you clip stuff inside the integral fenders. Oh, come on. maybe they patched that. It would be about damn time. It let you store stuff there for way too long. But I have a suspicion they did not, and it's just me not setting up the frames properly. Okay, well it looks like they actually finally fixed the icebox to a certain extent. But you used to be able to cram stuff in there, which was feeling pretty buggy. Or you can slap this part in the echo. So, like, generally speaking, if you see something, you can probably do it. If it looks like it'll fit, you can probably do it. Weapon meshes are where it gets kind of finicky, as you saw. But generally, they tend to be pretty good about it. It's more often the case that there's exceptions like these ones that I'm showing you, rather than it being the rule, if that makes sense. But it's the sort of thing you'll have to like play around with and try and understand the wildness of it. So for instance, this is actually done in the most recent pack, except it was a Hyperborea blueprint. So this has actually been something for a while, but not something that most people were aware of, I don't think. Is that you can actually wrap thin strike plates around the cheetah. So they actually do it in this pack, so, or in this Syndicate blueprint. So I'm sure it's like not like something they're aware of, but for instance, you can't anchor the thin strike plates in the cell where a cheetah is located because the cheetah's mesh tells the game, I guess, that it's blocking off that pip. But if you place the thin strike plates first, then you can actually have them wrap around the cheetah. And you can actually even do the same with a couple of weapons. Like the king, where normally you wouldn't be able to place it there. And you can't even attach stuff directly to it. But the meshes allow for it because there's no like physical overlap. So yeah, the meshes tend to be pretty good. Weapons are, like I said, more like those generally are a little bit more wonky, but that's probably just due in part to how complex their collision is, and of course the fact that they rotate and whatnot.
Well, that's pretty useful knowledge. Well, not that often, but I could always try it out if I ever need to fit something under a weapon or beside a weapon and it doesn't want to fit. I could always try to pick the weapon up and place it back down as a second part instead of the smaller part going in first.
It or whatnot, yeah. And some are a lot more like obvious than others. So for instance, the world
I think it's okay. I think I understand this part. I think it would be more beneficial if you come back to the build and maybe move on to the next tip.
For sure. And that's exactly it, like I said to begin with. It's not normally so much that there's any like one singular way to do things, but as you become more aware of the systems and their implications and intricacies, of course, you can sort of experiment and know like stuff, you know, like that occurs and kind of poke around with it. So for the build, generally, like I said, I tend to approach it from a high level first, because I found that that tends to be more conducive than trying to put parts together. So for instance, I did mention, I didn't save over it here, but I did mention the stuff about the frames and the armor and the bumpers. What I'd probably look at for a build to begin with is sort of hashing out the sort of gear that I know that I'd want with it, because that'll shape the overall outline of the build and then the sort of armor that you can put around it. So for instance, in this case, I take it, you know, that you probably are wanting to use the the storms as your main weaponry, right?
Yeah. Hello?
And because, sorry, I was drinking. And because the cabin options to you currently are rather restricted. You're knowing that you want to use it with the growl cabin, right?
Yep.
So at that point, it's the sort of thing where I would probably try and figure out where my sort of energy allocation is and what I'm wanting to do with it. So that's going to depend on the cabin, so its energy, its perk, and the weaponry. So for instance, while you have
Yeah, I have a good few of the radiators, but that's not the final plan with this build. I'm gonna get a third storm and put it on top, and then I'm gonna figure out what to do about the radiators or coolers, and check how much energy I have left to spend. Because I might also upgrade once I get the third storm. I probably should get a better generator to get at least that one more energy power, and then check what to do about that.
Right. So in this case, knowing that you want to run the therms and knowing that you want to run the growl, that lets you know that you are running 8 out of the 11 energy available. So for instance, like you mentioned, you knew you want to run radiators and coolers, and that totally makes sense because they're overheat weapons. But something like, okay, if you knew that you wanted to run, so let's say hypothetically you wanted to run the ghost cabin, wherever it is. Okay. So while that gives you an additional energy, so now you have 4 extra energy available, and it would be rather easy to slap on another weapon. It's important to note, okay, well, the Ghost's perk explicitly requires the vehicle to have stealth capabilities. So not only would your commitment be to whatever weaponry you have, but you'd also need to either plan to use a chameleon in order to actually use the cabin's perk, which is that while you're invisible you get bonus damage, or you need to choose to not run the chameleon, in which case your cabin's perk doesn't apply, and then it's sort of like, okay, well, why run the ghost, right? So in your specific example, you have 3 energy left over. So while your idea was to slap on another generator and slap on more radiators and coolers, personally, I feel like having about 75% of your energy being spent on weapons is a good, comfortable zone. So personally, I would kind of look at the sort of energy that you could spend with this arrangement. Because if you're only going to run 2 therms, then you don't really need a generator, in my eyes at least, when you already have 11 energy to begin with. So that gives you 3 energy left over. You chose to go with 3 breezes, a chill, and an engine. So that was 4 energy, so you ended up needing... Sorry, 5 energy, because you had 3 breezes. So you ended up needing a 2 energy generator on this, right? As a result, you ended up spending about 1/10 of your power score on your generator. The end effect was you got 75% overheating bonus from the breeze, and then a 50% overheating bonus from the chill. So you had 125% overheating bonus between all the radiators. If you run, and mind you, my modules here are fused, so they will be slightly more effective than like what you actually have available, but the performance relatively should be similar. If you stack a radiator and a cooler rather than just running multiple radiators, though, I found that the performance tends to be a bit better. I don't have the math set up right now. I don't suppose you've seen my post about reloading time versus reloading speed, or cooling time versus cooling speed, have you?
No. But I would assume there isn't really that much of a difference. Like in terms of DPS, if you shoot a stationary target for a long time, it doesn't matter which part is faster. Is it the reloading or the shooting longer? It's gonna come out to the same thing. But if in realistic conditions where the target's gonna sometimes move out of your sight, I would say it's just more beneficial to have the radiators, because it will allow you to just stop shooting at one point and then start shooting again instead of having just fast reload times, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so the way that the math on these work is that they do stack linearly. So, like you did mention, if you have multiple radiators, then it increases the amount of time that you have by the same amount. So, for instance, in your case, you have an R2 chill that gives you plus 50% overheating. You have, say, 2 more breezes, or even if you just use another single chill, then you get 100% overheat time. So you can fire for twice as long before overheating. Now, by you doing it with the R1 breeze, you are taking twice as much energy as is needed over the chills. So for instance, if I don't think I actually have 2 chills or 2 breezes, but for instance, if I just mock this up, so if you have your chill and it's unfused and it's 50%, and then you have a breeze and that's another 25%, and then you have another, the hell's my card jack? There we go. So if we pretend that this is another breeze, then you'd be maxing out your energy for 100% overheat, but running a second chill instead, and mind you, this is 3410 power score, but if you ran a second overheat, which I don't have again, so we're going to pretend that this is a second chill, then you actually have less power score for the same amount of overheating amount. And that's generally the trend with the modules, is running a single higher tier one is more effective than running multiple lower ones, because the power score drain of something is equivalent to its tier times its energy cost. So for instance, any blue item will have a cost of 130 power score per energy you spend. So you can see all of the 1 energy modules are 130. Generators are unique because they provide energy rather than take, so they have their own calculations. And then anything that requires 0 energy will be 115 power score. But again, there's outliers with things like the scopes, because these were actually adapted from something that did require energy to something that didn't, and they haven't updated the power scores. But it's the same with the weaponry. If you have, I don't think there's any 1 energy blue weapons, is there? So that makes the math a little bit harder.
Probably not.
But for instance, a borer is 2 energy of blue tier, so it's 260 power score. Likewise, a wasp is 4 energy, so it's 520 power score, etc. And it's pretty consistent all the way through. So if you have multiple items of the same tier of the same power, the same energy drain, so for instance most of the shotguns being 4, they'll all have the same power score. And the ratios are such that, like I said, generally running a single higher tier one is better than multiple lower tier. So that's going to be the case with you running multiple R1 breeze. You're going to save energy and power score and mass if you end up running 2 R2 chills rather than an R2 chill and 2 R1 breezes.
Well, that's actually, thanks for telling me about the power score, because I didn't really look at that that much. But the fact that I'm wasting energy points on having 2 breezes instead of 1 chill, I'm very aware of that. It's just that I'm upgrading other parts first before I get to the coolers or the radiators. That's the only reason I have still 2 breezes instead of 1 chill.
Right, and that's fair. And like I said, it's not like there's any one particular overarching, this is the better way to do things. It's about having this information available so that you can make those choices appropriately, right? So like you said, if you're prioritizing other parts, then okay, so maybe upgrading to another chill isn't your priority at the moment, like you said. But at the same time, it's sort of realizing too, okay, well, do you need to be spending this much energy on the overheating of the breeze? So as a autocannon, these are generally considered sniping weapons, and while that might not be the case with the way you play them, especially in the perk of the storm, it deals more damage the further away you are from targets. So let's say you wanted to maximize, and of course I don't have any storms, so unfortunately this is not very good mocking up on my end from not having the parts available, of course. But as a result of you wanting to be further away from things as you're shooting at them, you're probably going to find that just hold firing doesn't tend to be too effective, even if you're using... Let's see if I even actually have any long range overheat weapons. I guess the best example will probably be the Miller. So as a result of the Storm's perk being better damage at distance, you're probably going to find that you're going to want to use it. You know what, I'm being dumb. I'll just use the exhibitional now. Oh, these builds all suck. Good enough. You'll probably find that it's more effective to engage at further distances. So for instance, if I shoot from here, I deal 35 damage per shot. If I back up and get the perk activated more, 36. Whereas if I'm a lot closer, I'm dealing less damage. So this is obviously a lot bigger of a factor in an actual map where you're, hitting people, and of course being autocannons, you're going to be hitting multiple parts. So not only is 10% damage better, but you'll, see the effect more for 10% damage when you're hitting multiple parts with it. So as a result, personally feel like a lot of the time you want to be sniping with autocannons. So as a result, when you are, hold firing tends to not be too terribly effective, so you can see the spread gets pretty crazy pretty fast. And being
I usually try to actually stay medium range instead of going very far with the Storm, because I don't know about other autocannons, I didn't try many of them yet, but I would feel like the spread is pretty bad on these ones.
Well, that's going to be due in part to the range that you use them at, and then of course how much you are holding fire as well. So, I mean, like we see, obviously it becomes the ball is not a small target by any means, but if I just hold fire from this far away, I'm missing about half my shots at full spread, which isn't terribly useful. But being that it is that I gain extra damage at a distance, generally it's considered preferable with the autocannons to just tap fire. And that's actually the same with most MGs, is it's suggested to tap fire instead of just mag dump. Again, to what degree you actually want to use that's going to depend on the individual, but you can a lot more consistently deal damage with the autocannons, especially ones that scale with distance, by actually tap firing rather than just hammering, because you can see I'm actually dealing less damage in the same time period just due to the inaccuracy of it. So to that end, it's going to be up to you, of course, to what degree you actually want to lean into that. If you are going to be doing something like shooting at a distance and tap firing, then having a cooler is actually pretty important, because even if I just stop firing for a very slight amount of time, it actually lets me drop heat, and so I can sustain this firing rate nearly indefinitely. Whereas if you are going to be in closer distance, having radiators is preferable, because of course there's very little risk of you missing your target at this range. That being said, objectively, the perk of the autocannons does lead to preferring sniping, and thus looking at things like running a radiator and a cooler together in equal measure. The way the math works out, having multiple radiators, like you said, like you saw, is, it just adds linearly, right? If you add 50%, you now have 50% more overheat. If you add another 50%, you have another 50% more overheat. You have, 200% overheat. The way the coolers work is it increases the cooling rate. It doesn't decrease time. So you can actually get diminishing returns with them. So for instance, let's say you have a shiver, just for the math being a little bit easier, and you have it fused, so it's actually 100% cooling rate. So that's actually what I have. So it has 103% cooling rate by default. What that means is that if you use that, then it's going to have your weapon cooling time. So instead of taking, say, 4 seconds to cool from full, it'll take 2 seconds. So that's a pretty significant bonus. If you add another one, it doesn't do another 100% rate reduction. It ends up being something like 2/3, because instead of having 1 heat reduced per tick, it's now going to be 3. So it ends up taking 2/3 the time. So if you even end up having 10 shivers, it's going to take, like 1/10 the time. But it's not a significant gain at that point. At that point, you're spending a lot of energy for very nominal amounts of improvements. So likewise, it's sort of the thing where you generally want to balance overheating and cooling, because speccing into one explicitly isn't generally as effective as having one of each. So in the case of a radiator and cooler, if you have one of each and they do 100% each, which isn't how the math works, but for the sake of making the math easy, because of course the values are going to be similarly relevant anyway, if you have double the overheat and you have half the cooling time, it's going to allow you to have roughly 75% uptime, I want to say. It's going to depend on the cooling rates and overheating time of the weapons, but it allows you to fire for twice as long, and then when you're not firing, you're only not firing for half as long. On the other hand, like you said, if you're just meg dumping with things, or if you're running weapons whose perk want you to continue firing without stopping, like the equalizers, then you're pretty much going to want exclusively radiators, because you want to keep the damage uptime. But that'll be a personal decision. As far as the build itself, or how I would do it, is I'd do one of each. And actually I have... autocannons were actually one of my favorite ones to play around with as a newbie. So one of my first builds for like a higher power score, once I like had, the resources to do it, was actually an autocannon build, and was running very similar. So it's weird because the storms are 4 energy each, so you need 2 to 3 of them to be effective, which is 8 to 12 energy, whereas the whirlwinds are 5 energy each. But as a result, you generally only run 2, because running 15 energy of weapons on a build tends to be pretty rough. So it actually ends up having an easier energy economy with the next tier of weapons, because you can run 10 energy of the weapons and then 2 energy of supporting modules without needing a generator on a 12 energy cabin, which is pretty weird to me at least, but just a bit of a sidetrack. So that's actually, I think this is the 3rd time I've rebuilt this, because they keep changing perks. So for instance, the Step Spider originally had a mobility perk with spider legs, now it doesn't. So they changed classes, so they changed stats, so now this build is overweight. But I did get the challenge done for autocannons. Yeah, back in November of 2021, using that idea, using 2 whirlwind, or sorry, that's Hero. So even earlier. So I started playing in June of 2020, and by September I had gotten the 400 kills / assists with the whirlwinds by doing that idea, by running a spider that had 2 whirlwinds, a radiator, and a cooler. The choice is obviously yours. If you want to just continue using the radiators instead, you certainly can. But there's going to be trade-offs associated with it. What I ended up doing with something like the energy was completely different then than now, because the energy economy has changed. But in this case, you could of course go with multiple radiators again. You could theoretically go with another cooler if you're feeling it. Because of the diminishing returns of it in this case, I'd probably recommend, whether you do 2 radiators or a radiator and a cooler, sticking with just the 2 energy on those, because that'll give you another energy to do something with the utility. Now of course you could stick with just running more radiators, and if you want to, that's completely fine. What I probably would not recommend at this power score is actually running the engine, because not only is it an epic item, so it has a bit higher power score. It's not significant at this stage because it's only 1 energy cost, so the power score difference between a purple engine and a cyan engine is only about 100 power score. But this also gives you a perk that doesn't really matter a whole lot, and it's also going to be giving you a lot of mass limit, which you can't really take advantage of on this build when you don't even have the tonnage maxed out. So something like the extra energy, I don't know if you have, do you have like a chameleon or a radar or anything like that?
No, I do not.
Okay, so if you did want to continue going with the sniping route, that might be useful. Running a invisibility module. because that would let you reposition, get on top locations, basically make it harder for people to continue tracking you as you change from, you know, position to position. Of course, if you're playing more CQC, if you're playing more medium range, that might not necessarily be as important once you're actually fighting with somebody, and so to that end you might still prefer running a radiator or an engine. As far as for sniping
What
goes,
does CQC mean? Because that's like the third time you used it. I'm not sure what the CQC is.
It's an acronym for, well, I guess technically it's an initialism for close quarters combat. So being just in close range of people. Generally, okay, you can look at it as maybe not that one. I still don't have any sniping on. That's fine. I will just use our good old friend, the Cyclone, again. It's going to be terrible. So very loosely, you can understand close versus mid versus long range as like primarily the different range of effectiveness of the different weapon classes. So obviously your shotgun's ranges are going to be very restricted. You're not going to be able to use them out to a distance very effectively, which makes sense. I mean, that's how shotguns work in video games. Might not be how they work in real life, but that's how they work in video games at least. So you can generally consider shotgun range, so about 50-ish meters max, as your like close range, and then you can kind of consider your mid-range to be where your machine guns are effective, which ends up being to about 100 and 150 meters. There will of course be some overlap, and some weapons in each class are going to perform differently than others. Some will have a lot longer range than others, spread, damage drop-off, etc. But you can generally consider this that I'm shooting at right now to probably be around medium range, where your long range is generally reserved for things like the sniping autocannons, so the fixed-angled ones, or things like the autocannons, which, I mean, that's what a Cyclone is. So, like, while this is obviously a very high-tier example of it, it's a sort of weapon that has very little damage drop-off as an autocannon, so you can be effective with it out to very long distances. It's actually kind of funny too, because the Cyclone isn't even the sniping autocannon. That's how I use it, but that's just because I like it, and it doesn't suffer from damage drop-off. Most people would not consider the Cyclone a long-range weapon, really, but when talking about autocannons, generally, like I said, I treat them as long-range weapons. If you want to play them more, you know, medium range, that's your onus. But this is generally the sort of energy allocation that I would look at for it. Obviously, you wouldn't be running epic wheels, though. So, continuing with my example of what I do, once I know that I have these modules, I have this sort of energy allocation. If I did want to run, you know, another energy, or maybe in your case you do, I would kind of ask myself, okay, how much energy, how much power score do I actually want to put towards it? For the sake of, like I said, generally sticking within the tier of equipment you're running, I feel like at most running the ampere or the PU charge would be sufficient for the energy. Because if you're running the bootstrap for one more energy, you're literally adding another 500 power score just to throw on another, like, chill or something, which seems like pretty big overkill. Because you're spending 500...
I don't know if the difference is that big between the generators.
Well, it adds the power score of the generator itself and then the power score of the equipment. So for instance, if you wanted to add another breeze to your build, which is only 85 power score, that's not very much, but upgrading your generator and adding another module is adding 460 plus 85. So you're adding over 500 power score for the sake of one part. And that one part is only a 25% overheating, and you're already at 225% overheating So you're looking at adding what, about an eighth of your power score for like a 12% relative increase. Again, it's the sort of thing where it's up to you to sort of decide if that's the route you want to go. The other factor, which in my eyes is a little bit larger, is the cost discrepancy between them. Epics generally cost about $1,000 to 1,400 coins. With 1,400 coins, you could grab pretty much an entire set of special items. Like you could grab a hardcore, you could easily grab a listener if you didn't already have one, or maybe even a radar if you want to be more effective at medium range. You could add a cloaking module, you could get a fuel tank to gain more fuel per match. There's quite a few other things that you could afford with it, right? So it's sort of an opportunity cost for what you'd be giving up in order to do that, namely on the fiscal side of things. But there is also the diminishing returns of running like 4 of the same equipment, because if you were to buy a bootstrap or a gas gen, or maybe you grind for it, so theoretically it doesn't cost you a whole lot of money because you're just spending the resources, but I mean realistically you could always sell the resources and have like the grand of coins. You could instead look at replacing your multiple breezes with another chill for the same effect, for less power score, for less energy, for 1/10 of that cost. So that's sort of, I believe I mentioned it I mentioned it a lot because it's kind of the core how I play the game. But when I went through, which is maybe a little bit more obvious with the trials, but the way that I sort of looked at progressing through the game and kind of setting and meeting goals was going through and completing all the trials of tiers of weapons and then moving up to the next tier once I did that. So I would go and I'd get the common tiers done, which are only 3 weapons. Then I'd go and look at getting the rare tiers done, obviously a little bit more variety, and then special, epic, etc. So right now the only weapons I have left are relics. As a result of that, because I was going through and I was only really dealing with 1 tier of equipment and weapons at a time, it let me mess around with different cabins. It let me get familiarized with the weapons, which, I mean, the patches require. It's something like, only 120 kills or assists for the rare tier items, where epics can very quickly get up to needing 800 kills or assists in order to be quote-unquote done with them. And then of course you can play around with different modules as you go. I found that if you kind of sort of spec into one thing and just sort of drill down and try and go deep down that tier, rather than sort of investing and playing around with other smaller, cheaper items as you're, just gaining wealth by doing your dailies, doing your weeklies, doing your raids, buying battle passes, whatever, you tend to hit like brick walls of progression pretty quickly. So I'm sure it probably hasn't been too bad for you to the stage of getting like the storms, for instance. But if you wanted to progress and have the next thing you do be, for instance, getting whirlwinds or getting bootstrap, then you're very quickly looking at the next step costing 1,000 coins for each of those next steps. Even things like cabins can become pretty expensive. The example I've given a couple of times of the Ghost is one of my personal recommendations, because not only is it a pretty strong generalist cabin, and also works quite well with sniping if you're going to have cloaking, but it's also one of the cheapest epic cabins, so this is only the cost of about a special. But basically, like, costs can snowball very quickly. Likewise, if you got sick of the whirlwind and wanted to go to the stillwind, it's actually one of the most expensive legendaries in the game. It can cost you up to 10,000 coins each. With 10,000 coins, you can make entire epic builds. So again, sort of up to you as a user to decide what sort of progression you want to do and what that looks like. But personally, I found that because I was sidewinding through a bunch of the lower tiers and collecting and messing around with all the other cheaper equipment before moving on to the next one, that I had more time to build wealth by doing missions, doing dailies, doing weeklies, doing battle passes, whatever. And it made getting into the next tier more affordable and easy, because I could just buy, the couple of modules that I was missing. If you were to go and like spec super hard into a sniping auto cannon instead, then you'd need probably, a new cabin, and at least you have the weapons for it currently, but then you might want to look at the epic radiators and coolers, you might want to look at an Epic engine, an Epic generator, maybe an Epic radar, stuff like that, wheels to support it, because you're probably not going to have enough tonnage in most instances with just using APC wheels, stuff like that. So it can stack up pretty quick. So that's just sort of a, I don't want to say warning, but just something to consider, I think, that depending on how and when, where you want to progress, that could affect how easy it is for you to reach those next tiers. But so long as you're running like the special and rare stuff, it's honestly easy enough to acquire them. Like as you mentioned, like you can even realistically look at grabbing a couple of epics within, you know, a week or so, less than, of grinding. It's not too bad, especially because you already have a pretty cohesive build by having a radiator, having a cooler, you know, having the growl cabin, having the special weapons already. Have you played around with the scopes or radars at all?
I have just the grey radar, just for the increased range of detection. And as to the scope, I was thinking of getting one of the scopes because it would be actually pretty useful. So I'll probably mount one pretty soon.
Yeah, that's probably not a bad idea. That's actually what I'd recommend as an autocannon user looking at doing, is increasing your intel capabilities. So like the Ruby obviously works as a base one again. The nice thing about radars and now scopes, although it didn't used to be that way, is that they don't cost any energy. So the only considerations with slapping them on are power score, which at this point is probably not a huge one when they're only 100 power score each. And then any durability expended for, you know, protecting them or mass for them. But again, it generally shouldn't be too bad. Like, this was sort of what I was getting at too with the, you know, getting items of similar tiers and whatnot. Like you buying a Horizon and a Listener is pretty easy to be able to afford both of those within a week. And they'd significantly increase the viability of your build by increasing, you know, not only how far out you can see and ping enemies, but also how effectively you can actually aim at them with the Horizon. Because there are pretty significant differences between them. So by default, it's, what, 2.8 times zoom. So I don't know if maybe that's part of the reason why you weren't like sniping. Like I know you explicitly said you felt like the storms weren't too terribly accurate, but like I did also mention that a large part of that is going to be based off of hold firing rather than tap firing. But with a 2.8 times, even just tap firing the stuff, it's kind of hard to hit a target that's about 150, 200 meters out. I guess it helps if I actually go to the range line. So that's, yeah, 150 meters out, and it's pretty easy to hit the target currently when they're stationary, but of course when they start driving around and with projectile lead time and everything, it can start getting a little bit more dicey. When you're looking at attacking stuff out to, you know, 300, 400 meters, it's definitely not happening. Even if I grab ones with significantly more tight spread, like it would be difficult for me to consistently hit that guy if they're moving around. If you slap on the Horizon, the Iris I think would probably be preferable for you personally if you're using it in more mid-range, because it doesn't move the viewpoint and it's also a lower magnification tier than these other ones, so it's a little less annoying to try and hit people in CQC with it. But unfortunately, because it was a Battle Pass exclusive, it's like stupidly expensive. Literally costs more than most epics at the moment. I probably wouldn't worry about it too much. But going from that 2.6 times to 6.5 times makes it a hell of a lot easier to hit things at distance. And of course, if you do end up going with, for instance, the neutrino scope, that's even stronger of an effect, because the thing, if you fuse it, goes up to almost 10 times zoom. Have you poked around with the neutrino on the exhibition at all?
Nope.
Something that I'd maybe suggest poking around at is sort of familiarizing yourself with the different modules and options available, especially for one specific tier class. So for instance, while you don't necessarily need to know anything about the reload boosters at this point, or like the Argus or the power unit or like most of the hardware, knowing that, okay, I want to poke around with scopes, I want to poke around with radars, might be useful to kind of understand the different types. So the neutrino is actually very interesting because its perk is kind of a twofold one. So it actually has, I'm just gonna move this back, slap this on the roof. It actually has two effects. So first off, not only does it have the zoom, but it secondly has a thermal view. So it's a lot easier, as you can imagine, to see enemies that are highlighted in white than it on a gray background than it is normally here. Like even
Yeah, I straight away noticed when you were using it before. That's like one of the reasons why I thought about getting a scope even more. But it's the purple one, so it might take me a long time. It's not even that useful for me right now to get that scope. So
yeah, exactly. It's definitely the sort of thing that would be sort of a stretch or a longer term goal, especially if you did spec more into sniping, because having a 9.6 times zoom doesn't do you any good if you're attacking at like these ranges, right? Because generally people are going to be driving around fast enough that you almost don't want to be zoomed in. But even like with this, you can see on sort of the edge of the field of view, it's kind of hard to discern the enemy from the background with a 6.5 times, whereas with the neutrino, it literally paints them in white. So it's hard to miss them. So that's really nice. And that's not actually even its perk. Its perk is that it will actually highlight explosives, but only on enemies within radar range. So that's where the radar and the scopes kind of work together. So of course you have the ruby. I'd probably suggest looking at getting a listener, because it does have another 50% range over the ruby, and the difference between 300 and 450 range is basically the difference between the default autocannon range and sort of the max threshold you'd be looking at hitting on most maps. So for instance, if I have that, you can actually see the, other than when the target car gets in the way, hilariously enough, it actually blocks the view angle a little bit. So you can actually see the enemy's explosives at range, which is very convenient. So again, it's literally the highest tier scope, but that's sort of where you definitely want to have a radar. But even without running the neutrino, having the radar is also extremely convenient for even just highlighting the enemies that your car can see. Because if an enemy is within range, they'll automatically have a red triangle above them and they'll show up on your radar. So for instance, even if you have the radar and you're not even facing them, you can actually still see them on the map as long as you have line of sight, which is very convenient again as a sniper. And probably what I'd probably suggest looking at next. So if you were to say, go with that and say, okay, well, let's say that you had a scope and a radar. Then at this stage, it would be where you can really start looking at sort of, oh, thank you, Epic Games Story. At this point, this is where you kind of have all your hardware figured out. Maybe you have the wheels determined. Like I said, you could run, different engines. I'd probably recommend just sticking with the like free ones, the ones that don't cost in energy, even if you do go with a engine, just because most of these other ones aren't really going to have perks that are terribly important to you at this stage. And again, you only have so much energy economy at this point. But if you do something like that, you can see this actually gives you enough max mass that you could stand to have some more wheels. So you could say throw on the redundant pair of wheels. And this is kind of how I'd approach building, knowing, okay, if I'm running weapons of X tier and X energy, and I have a cabin of Y, then I know that I have this much energy to play around with. Maybe I want to throw on some items that don't require energy for hardware. So there'd also be stuff like radios, if you're not running one with a built-in radio. So for instance, the wall hack radars, the Maxwell and the Doppler actually give the increased ally transmission radius effect as well, but the default radar will not. So obviously sharing the information with your teammates is kind of important. Whether or not they actually do anything with that information is completely up to them, and unfortunately a lot of the time the answer is no, but at least you're giving them the opportunity to do so, especially for only 65 power score. It's a very nice small compact size because the antenna doesn't actually have any collision, so it's basically a 2x2x1 box. And then you could also look at, of course, maybe adding your fuel tank, your fuel barrel. Now that being said, this just as is, this is without running any generator, this is without running any decor for the reputation boost, which is another thing I'd recommend, of course, and this is without running any armor. You're looking at about 4,000 power score, where your prior one was 4,700. So with 3,500 kilos of, almost 3,600 kilos of, you know, tonnage to work in, I'm not so sure you'd even really be able to do a great job of armoring within that limit. I don't know. I generally don't aim for specific power scores. I'll generally try and make a cohesive build like this, and then I'll armor it to a power score that seems reasonable. So for instance, if I just throw on a bunch of these high mass, low power score parts, you can see you could get up to about 4,500 with it, which could work. But if you end up using your damage pass-through parts, if you use your bumpers, if you use your less dense armor, of course you'll end up getting different values. It'll be up to you again to sort of determine what power score, etc. you'll want to end up at. Like I said, I don't have particular targets. If you do with 4,700 and whatnot, that might actually change what you end up doing for armoring. So I don't believe I've shared the structural part calculator with you before.
No, you did not.
So this is something I have, I guess I don't really need to show the post. Talked about a bit in the past. I do still update it, even though I don't do like announcements on the Reddit for it anymore. But I actually made it, it's rather rudimentary, it's not anything fancy, but a rather basic tool for looking at the different stats of different structural parts. So this actually ties into what you're talking about with the different power score for durability and whatnot. So you can probably find this pretty easily. I mean, my search results are going to be biased, of course, because this is literally something that I've searched up before and was posted by me. But there's the post about it, there's the video about it, in the links. When it loads, obviously it's struggling with everything I'm doing on the computer right now. There's the workbook for it, so a few different options for it, but in any case I'll just give you a quick rundown on it here. Basically it's just a culmination of all of the structural parts in the game and how they have their different stats and the calculations you can do with it. So for instance, each faction and each type of part will generally have very similar ratios. And if you're familiar with game design at all, this should be fairly obvious. They're not going to go and assign unique values to each part in the game. They're going to say, okay, lunatic parts will generally have this much power score and this much mass per pip, and then applying that to all of the lunatic parts of that type. So for instance, the engineer frame parts have rather high power score generally, but because of the damage pass-through, their effective durability is 10 times what's listed, so they actually have monstrously high stats, again, assuming that you have some sort of spacer to prevent things from behind it taking damage, or you're okay with the things behind it taking that damage. Lunatics all the way to Steppenwolfs, and the ratios are pretty much what you'd expect. Basically, the heavier parts are more durable, they give you more durability per power score, they give you more durability per volume, so they are more dense, but they end up having less durability per mass, which is to say they're rather heavy parts, even considering the amount of durability you get off of them. So if you're running something like the Growl, which is rather light, it's a light cabin, it's not going to be able to carry a whole lot of mass, you'll probably want to say, you know, figure out how much power score, how much mass, how much durability you actually want to aim for. And of course the volume thing is going to be something as well, because you generally don't want to run an enormous, like monstrous build with a bunch of small parts unless you're running, you know, like a spaced armor build. But this is sort of like a foundation of knowledge that you can kind of extrapolate off of. So for instance, these calculations are all approximate, especially the syndicate one, because their sizes and shapes and whatever are everywhere. But basically what this page is for is I looked at the most filling piece of a certain type per faction, which is to say some parts have, you know, concavity, so they'll have gaps and they won't like fill a full piece, like how you could fit the thin strike plate in the cheetah, because the cheetah isn't a block, it has corners cut off, and the thin strike plate also has, you know, its corners cut off. So I took the part with the least amount of concavity on each of them. In the case of the Firestarter's hot rod, it was actually annoying because the Flaming Rakes is the least concave part, and yet it still has concavity. But most of the other ones are pretty easy, like the Lunatics, they have a 4x4x1 part where there's no gaps or curves. Same with the Engineers, same with most of these other ones. And then I just threw in the values and got the rough calculations. So this is what it's saying for that part of that faction. This is approximately the values you can expect from it. So for instance, the Engineers have a couple of different series. There's the frame parts, which is very misleading because it's not a frame part, it's a, you know, a damage pass-through. It's not like the frames that you set your cabin on. But in any case, in-game, the designation for this series is frame. So if I open up, maybe it'll make a bit more sense. I actually open up the inventory. So each faction will have its own set of parts, of course, and then each set of parts is actually part of a series of parts. So for instance, these parts, if you look underneath the name, it says Buggy Trunk Frame Part. So that's the series. It's part of the Frame Part series. And then the banner background for it shows the Engineer logo, which is it's an Engineer part of the Frame series called Buggy Trunk. So likewise, this is a Lunatic part of the Buggy series called the Buggy Fender, etc., etc. So for instance, the Engineers have a couple of different ones because they're the starter faction. So there's also the Torino set of parts, which you'll get from leveling up. They have the Struts parts, which is part of leveling up. There's the Minivan parts. And then there's a couple of ones from Prestiges as well called Hot Rod, which are all different parts from the Engineers. So for instance, you saw there's basically 4 different parts from Engineers just there. I don't have all of the different ones exhaustively shown, mostly because it seems a little redundant to show all the different Prestige series, because there's like 2 per faction and there's only like 6 to 8 parts for each, and all of them are generally pretty concave, so it's difficult to get exact measurements of the values. But this kind of gives you a rough idea of how the parts perform compared to another, and what ones would be good for what. So for instance, the ones that are not very dense, like the Lunatic parts or the Firestarter parts, those are very popular for spaced armor because they're large pieces, they're very light, and if you're letting the damage pass through get deleted anyway, you don't really need to have the parts have a whole lot of durability. Whereas on the other hand, if you're making tanks, if you're making heavy vehicles, something that has a lot of durability per power score lets you squeeze out, you know, 4,000 or 5,000 health in the for cabin durability, never mind the total vehicle durability when you look at something in the 10,000 power score list. So this is a general overview. Hopefully this kind of makes sense to you so far.
Yeah, makes sense.
And then we get into the nitty-gritty. So this data page is hidden by default, so you don't need to worry about it if you don't want to. But this is basically all of the values for all of the structural parts in game. Eventually I might add the other parts, like some people will use wheels as armor, some people will use decor as armor, stuff like that. I haven't added that in yet because it doesn't feel super important, but this is basically all of the different values and my calculations as a result of it. So for instance, the effective durability means how much damage you can expect it to, you know, take before destroying. So for instance, those buggy parts, their effective durability is 10 times the listed value because of the 90% damage pass through. And likewise, some parts will have melee durability. So the example of the train ply, you remember how you said you were having issues chewing through those?
Yep.
So that's because when you look at the actual amount of effective durability they have, it's not only the 416 durability, but that's effectively multiplied by 10. So you have to effectively deal 4,000 damage to it with your borer to destroy it. So yeah, they can get pretty crazy pretty fast. The color coding is mostly for my own reference, because again, this sheet is hidden by default. People can play around with it and update it as they prefer. I update the sheet, so you can always just download a new copy. But all of the gray cells are calculation ones, so I don't suggest playing around with those. So if you wanted to change the durability because something got buffed or nerfed, you'd want to probably change the raw value, so the listed durability value, and these will automatically update, rather than trying to say, oh, now it's 200 effective durability, you know, because the other values won't update if you update these ones because they're already calculated. Orange filled cells are ones I don't have, so I need to confirm the stats of. So I feel pretty confident with things like how many you get and the power score and the durability and the mass, but some of these parts won't have very obvious volumes because, like I said, the prestige part sets, these tend to be pretty concave, so some of the volumes I'm not sure of, and some of the locations in the list I'm not sure of. This tries to mimic what you'd see in game, so as you'd scroll the same order of parts you'd see, and it doesn't always make sense because it goes engineers, lunatics, fire starters, engineers again, a different type of engineer, a different type of engineer, nomads, and then engineers again. So this isn't really user friendly, but it is designed to at least look like how it looks in game. So you can kind of use it as a checklist of sorts to know how many parts you have and what part would come next in the list. As a result, I'm not sure for parts I don't have if they're the right way in the list. I just kind of throw them together with the other kinds of theirs, but they could be located in other places in the list. That's basically what the orange means. Orange volume means I'm not totally confident that that's the amount of space it takes up. Red is actually unique because there's only 2 of these parts. And the reason for that is because the parts were actually leaked. So I guess I should ask first, do you care to see these parts, or you want to keep it a surprise for when they eventually come out, or?
No, that's okay. You can show it to show it to me.
Okay, so basically a few months ago when we got the Furia, so are you familiar with the Catalina pack?
I've heard a bit about it, but I'm not that familiar.
That's fine. So it's one of the newest packs. So it added a new cabin, it added a new hardware, it has parts as per usual, and then generally when a new pack comes out, it'll also offer new structural parts. So in this case, these ones came out with the Furia, just like how the Steel Shield pack that just came out with the King of Birds, which was a new passive melee weapon, and it came out with a new hologram. So what generally happens, this is something I personally disagree on, but I digress. The new parts, when they come out in a pack, are generally available to be bought via the badge exchange a couple of weeks after, because, I don't know, they have to update or get approval from Microsoft or whatever. I don't know what the case is. Maybe they even prevent it from going on the badge exchange to begin with, just so that you know, more people are likely to buy the pack and get the new parts. I don't know what it is, but I should hope that you're familiar with the badge exchange to begin with, at least.
Very, very likely, but can you just show me? Because I'm not exactly sure which, where's the badge exchange? Yeah. Oh, this one, yeah, I know what it is.
Yeah, so, and it's possible that you might not have had it unlocked, or some of the parts here might still be hidden for you and whatnot. I don't have any parts here because I already have them all. But basically, when new parts come out, like I said, generally 2 to 3 weeks later, maybe a month, they'll come out on the badge exchange and you can exchange badges for them. Now, originally what they did is they made them available via the factions with prestiges. But it's obviously pretty tough to get to this stage unless you buy the packs, which already have the parts and give them to you, because you have to max out a faction, and then you have to get 1 million EXP, so about a week's worth of completing dailies, and then you get 1 part, or if it's a left part, you'll also get the right together. So for instance, I'm leveling up Dawn's Children. They're level 15. The prestige parts, there's 6 parts total, but if you get a right phalanx, you also get the left phalanx at the same time. If you get the left rib, you also get the right rib, etc., etc. So there's basically 4 prestige rewards here. So for you to get all 6 of the famine parts, you'd need to reach level 15 with Dawn's Children and then gain another 6 million EXP. So that's not very approachable for new players if they're interested in buying, if they're interested in the new parts, because it would be a long ways off. So what they've done instead is not only can you buy them via the pack and you'll just instantly unlock them, but like I said, you can get them via the badge exchange as well. So when the Furia came out, they actually released the wrong parts. They are not even properly labeled yet. It's literally the Wuling Mini of Mars exclusive nose cut. Oh, you're killing me. And the likewise rear cut. So these are 2 parts that haven't been released. They're very obviously Syndicate, based off of like all the markings on them and just the background of them. But they had the wrong parts show up, which was kind of funny. So as a result, we have the stats recorded for them, and some people, myself included, were able to make builds of them, with them, that is. So about a few days later, they got wise to it, and they deleted the parts from viewing ship in-game. So I posted this build on the exhibition, but they ended up deleting it, the parts in it, so, or hiding them or whatever. So when they updated it, this build actually didn't have the front or back anymore. It was every part that was already in the game, but the 2 hidden parts weren't even shown anymore, which was kind of crazy because I didn't think they had the ability to go and actively delete parts from a build already posted to exhibition, but obviously they did, and I maybe shouldn't be surprised because they're developers and they probably don't want stuff leaking. So yeah, those are those 2 parts, which is wrong one. Which is why these ones are highlighted in red, because not only are the values based off of what they were when they leaked, so they might change when they come out, but these parts might never actually come out either. So if you see them on the list and you're wondering where you get them, the answer is you currently don't. But that's the data page, and then the tool itself, which is where all of the fun stuff comes together, is the actual sorting of it. So what you can do is you can search for a specific, basically, type of value you're looking to optimize for, and it will give you the list of the parts. So for instance, currently it's set up so you get the effective durability per volume. So that's effectively saying the armor density of a part from high to low. So this is going to be giving you the most durable parts first, and then the least durable parts later. And then you can also choose to include or exclude the bumpers and passive melee weapons, because these values don't actually, give you cabin durability. So for instance, if you wanted to have something optimized for the power score, you might want to say, okay, maybe I want the raw durability of it, so I don't maybe want damage pass-through parts or something like that, and maybe I want to directly contribute to the cabin health, so I don't want bumpers and passive melee weapons. So that'll give you the parts, and like I said, the reflectors are the first part by far over any other structural part in the game for the durability per volume. So yeah, this is a tool that you can play around with. Like I said, I mean, this is obviously my copy, all the links are here, but you can just make a copy of this for yourself and then sort of play around with the different part values. So I did make this, and then it ended up not being super important to me, mostly because when you have as many hours in the game as I do, you've already internalized this stuff, so you don't really need to explicitly know what is the absolute most durable part for whatever specific scenario. Like normally you just know, okay, I'll go with the specific parts that I use. So for instance, I use the APC bumper a lot.
Your mic is cracking really badly right now.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I can restart that set. One sec. Is that any better?
Seems better now.
Great.
Can you start wrapping things up a bit now? Because I feel like I really need to get some sleep soon.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This was sort of the last thing I want to go over, as like you can use this as an asset and you can play around with it. Just for the specific parts you're using. If you want it to only show the parts that you have, you'll want to edit the data tool, but otherwise you can just sort of, go off of what you know, or aim for different parts as you get them available in the future. So that's a tool that's available
it's
to
gonna be pretty useful. But if I need to build a new build, and I want to look at parts, or even just looking at parts just as a matter of interest, you can send it to me on X or Reddit. I'll use it. Definitely.
Sure. Well, here, I can just get you the link right now, actually. There you go.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so that's a tool if you want to go through the absolute nitty-gritty. Otherwise, I kind of just generally armor stuff sort of as I see fit. So what I'll do, if you're good for here, I mean, I obviously talked a lot, especially about the different modules and whatnot. So there's some food for thought for you for how you actually want to approach your build and how you want to sort of get the modules for it. So what we can probably do is end it here. I will save over the current version I have just so I don't have to rebuild it. If you want me to in the next one, I can also just re-download it if you want, because obviously you have it on the exhibition as well. But then next time we talk, whether it be tomorrow or in a couple of days again or whatever, I can probably go through how I'd look at placing the modules on this build and then how I'd go about armoring it, if that works for you.
Okay, yeah, that would be pretty useful next time.
Excellent. Okay, well that is, I think probably a really good time to cut it off for me, and from the sounds of it, you as well. So if that's going to work for you today, I will catch up with you again, I guess, next time you're free.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for the help. Thank you for all tips. I'll see you next time.
Absolutely. Have a good night.
Bye-bye. Or good, actually. It's basically, it's exactly 10:48 over here.
Yeah.